Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why some decisions feel easier than others, especially when you are dealing with money? Maybe you are more careful when you might lose something, but a bit more daring when you could gain. Today we're diving into a fascinating study that explores something called complexity aversion, and how it works differently when we're thinking about gains versus losses. This paper asks a big question. When do we avoid complicated choices? And does it matter if we're talking about making money or potentially losing it? Think about buying a new phone. One option might have a straightforward price and features. Another might have a complex payment plan with hidden fees and different service tiers. Which one do you pick? And does your choice change if we're talking about saving for a down payment versus trying to avoid a big bill? The researchers here were curious about how we handle decisions that aren't just risky but also complicated to understand. They noticed that in the past, studies mostly looked at how people avoid complex choices when there are potential gains. But what happens when the choices involve losses? Do we still shy away from complexity, or does something else take over? They proposed two main ideas. One idea is that we avoid complexity because it takes more mental effort to figure out. If that is true, then complexity should bother us the same way whether we're gaining or losing. The other idea is that complexity makes us feel uncertain about the true value of an option. And how we feel about uncertainty can change depending on whether we're looking at gains or losses. This second idea predicts that we might be less bothered by complexity when we're facing potential losses. So, how did they test this? They ran two experiments. In both studies, they created scenarios where people had to choose between different options. The key was that some options were presented simply, while others were made more complex. They did this by using arithmetic expressions instead of just showing the final numbers. For example, instead of seeing you win 100, you might see something like 20 plus 50. This made people think a bit harder to figure out the actual outcome. In the first study, people had to choose between two risky options. They were either in a gain block, where all outcomes were positive, or a losses block, where all outcomes were negative. They repeated these choices many times. They made sure the gambles in the gain and loss domains were structured identically, just with the signs flipped. This way, any differences in choices would likely be due to the gain versus loss nature of the outcomes, not the gambles themselves. And here is what they found. In study 1, people chose the complex options much less often when they were dealing with gains. But when it came to losses, people were pretty much indifferent between simple and complex options. They were complexity averse for gains, meaning they preferred simpler choices, but complexity neutral for losses, meaning complexity didn't seem to matter as much. This strongly supported the idea that complexity affects us differently, depending on whether we're gaining or losing. They also looked at how long people took to make their choices. In gains, choosing the complex option took longer than choosing the simple one, which makes sense if it is harder to process. But in losses, this difference in decision time between simple and complex options was much smaller. To make sure their findings weren't just a fluke, they ran a second study. This time, people chose between a sure option and a risky option. Again, they played with the complexity of these options. And the results were very similar. Again, participants chose complex options less often in the gain domain and were complexity neutral in the loss domain. This confirmed their earlier finding complexity aversion is much stronger when we're aiming for gains compared to when we're facing potential losses. In study 2, they also got a clearer picture of risk preferences. In the gain domain, people were risk averse, meaning they preferred a sure thing over a gamble with the same expected outcome. But in the loss domain, they became risk-seeking, preferring the gamble over the sure loss. This classic reflection effect is a well-known pattern in decision-making. To dig deeper, they asked participants to rate how complex and how uncertain they felt about the options. People consistently rated complex options as more complex and, importantly, more uncertain than simple options. This confirmed that complexity does indeed create a sense of doubt. So, what does all this mean? The researchers concluded that the idea of complexity increasing cognitive uncertainty and how we react to that uncertainty, depending on whether we're dealing with gains or losses, is the better explanation. It is not just about mental effort, it's about how that effort leads to uncertainty. And how that uncertainty feels different when we stand to gain versus when we stand to lose. When we're going for gains, this added uncertainty from complexity makes us even more cautious. We see it as an extra risk we don't want, so we avoid the complex option. But when we're facing losses, our usual risk-seeking tendency in that domain kicks in. This means we're more willing to accept the uncertainty that comes with complexity. perhaps even hoping that the uncertainty might lead to a better outcome, or at least spread out the potential negative impact. An interesting point is that complexity aversion doesn't flip into complexity seeking in the loss domain. Instead, it just kind of disappears. This suggests that while we might be more open to risky options when facing losses, we're not necessarily seeking out complexity itself. The motive might be to avoid the worst-case scenario, and complexity doesn't necessarily help with that. The researchers also considered other possibilities. Could it be that decisions just get more random when we're dealing with losses? They found this wasn't the case, as people still showed clear risk-seeking behavior, and their performance on certain tasks remained high. Another idea was satisficing, where we accept the first option that meets our needs. While this might play a role, the study's findings on decision times and clear risk taking patterns suggested something more specific was going on. This research has some really important implications. For one, it tells us that when economists or psychologists measure how much people dislike risk, they need to be careful. If one option is more complex than another, people might be avoiding the complexity, not just the risk itself. This could skew how we understand people's true risk preferences. For everyday decisions, this means that understanding how complex something is can be just as important as understanding the potential gains or losses. Think about financial products, insurance policies, or even instructions for a new gadget. If they're too complex, we might not choose them even if they're actually a good deal. And it suggests that how a problem is framed as a gain or a loss can really change how we feel about complexity. This is something marketers and policymakers could use for better or worse to influence our choices. Simplifying information is key, but also understanding that the domain of the problem, gain or loss, plays a huge role in whether we're willing to wrestle with that complexity. So, what's my take on this? I think this study does a fantastic job of showing that our brains don't just process numbers, they process the feeling of uncertainty and effort, and that feeling changes depending on the context. The fact that complexity aversion disappears in losses, but doesn't flip to seeking is a really nuanced finding. It suggests that when facing losses, our primary goal might be to minimize the damage, and complexity doesn't necessarily offer a clear path to that. One limitation, as the authors mention, is that their experiments use relatively small stakes. In real life, when a lot of money is on the line, we might put in more effort to understand complex options, or our risk preferences might change. Future research could definitely explore those high-stake scenarios and see if the gain-loss asymmetry in complexity aversion holds up. I'd also love to see studies using eye tracking to see exactly where people look and for how long when dealing with complex choices, especially across gains and losses. Overall, this is a super important piece of research that adds a layer of complexity, no pun intended, to our understanding of decision making. It reminds us that making choices is about more than just math. It is about how we feel about the process and the potential outcomes. And those feelings are highly context dependent. What do you think? Do you find yourself avoiding complex choices more when you are trying to save money versus when you are trying to avoid a bill? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this dive into the psychology of decision making. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science breakdowns. We'll see you next time.